Joshua chapter 11, we'll start reading at verse 10. Joshua at that time turned back and took Hazor and smote the king thereof with the sword. For Hazor before time was the head of all those kingdoms.
You turn your mic on. I forgot. Oh, it is on. All right.
Can you hear me now? Technical difficulties, please stand by.
This is it. No, just. I gave him the wrong mic.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Good to go. Testing 1, that better? Okay. All right, let's start over. Joshua chapter 11, verse 10. And Joshua at that time turned back and took Hazor and smote the king thereof with the sword, for Hazor before time was the head of all those kingdoms. And they smote all the souls that were therein with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was not any left to breathe. And he burnt Hazor with fire. And all the cities of those kings and all the kings of them did Joshua take, and smote them with the edge of the sword. And he utterly destroyed them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded. May God add his blessings to the reading of his word. So last time we saw the beginning of the conquest of the northern part of the promised land, and how that Jabin, the king of Hazor, had brought together this alliance of all the people up there in the north. And this Armageddon-like battle was to take place. And Joshua had went up and took his army with him to face them. And they had won a great victory there. And so that brings us here to verse number 10, where it says, And Joshua at that time turned back and took Hazor, and smote the king thereof with the sword, for Hazor before time was the head of all those kingdoms. Now, Hazor was where Jabin was king, and he was the one who had formed this alliance and brought them all together to fight against God's people in this one last ditch effort to stop their conquest of the promised land. And so once this battle has been fought and been won, Joshua decides he's going to turn back and take this city. And he does just that. Kills Jabin, smites the king, the Bible says. It says, for Hazor was before time the head of all those kingdoms. So basically what he's doing there, I guess you could say, is he's cutting off the head of the snake. says it was the head of all those kingdoms. So he is striking down the capital or the lead city of that area. A very strategic move on Joshua's part. Then in verse 11 it says, and they smote all the souls that were therein with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was not any left to breathe, and he burnt Hazor with fire. I think it's interesting the way the writer here, which was most likely Joshua, by the way, how he phrases this. He says, and they smote all the souls. He didn't say they smote all the people, but instead he used the word souls there, which is a reminder to you and I that these are not just empty beings that are being disposed of here. These are people that have an eternal soul that are being killed. And so we can imagine just how many people went to hell as a result of this. This soul, these people were meeting with their eternal destiny because of what Joshua and God's people were doing here. And which should always remind us that no matter who we're dealing with, no matter what we may think of them, they're not just an empty container. Okay, they're not just a fleshly body. There's a soul in there. And you and I should have a great concern for that soul. Regardless of what we think of the person and the life that they live, they have a soul, and that soul is precious to God. And you and I should be doing everything we can to try and lead that person to Jesus Christ, that that soul might be saved. It says there were none, not any, left to breathe. So it was clear that they were following God's command here. That's what he told them to do. Don't leave any breathing. So they weren't just to maim or cripple these people and leave them for dead. They were to kill them, make sure that none were left alive. And they were carrying this out. And this verse reminds us that there is the breath of life, and that comes from God. And he breathed that into man, into Adam, long ago. And so that was being taken away here. And it says, and he burnt Hazor with fire. So he doesn't just overtake the city, he doesn't just conquer it, he burns it to the ground, most likely. Then there in verse 12 it says, and all the cities of those kings and all the kings of them did Joshua take and smote them with the edge of the sword. And he utterly destroyed them as Moses the servant of the Lord commanded. So all these kings of the north that had joined in this alliance with Jabin, following the lead of Hazor, they're all taken out. And all their cities as well are taken. And it says he's doing this as Moses the servant of the Lord commanded. Now I wanted us to look at this command that had been given to Moses long before this. So turn back with me now, if you would, to the book of Numbers, chapter 33. Numbers 33, starting with verse number 50. What we have here are God's instructions for conquering Canaan. God's instructions for conquering the promised land. As in verse 50 it says, and the Lord spake unto Moses in the plains of Moab by Jordan near Jericho, saying, speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, when ye are passed over Jordan into the land of Canaan. That's where we are. They've crossed over the Jordan. They're in Canaan, and they're in pursuit of this conquest. He says, then ye shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, and destroy all their pictures, and destroy all their molten images, and quite pluck down all their high places. And ye shall dispossess the inhabitants of the land, and dwell therein. For I have given you the land to possess it, and ye shall divide the land by lot for an inheritance among your families. So, 4 things God told them to do. His instructions for conquering Canaan. Number 1, drive out. Number 2, destroy. Number 3, dwell. And number 4, divide. The first instruction was to drive out. In verse 52, he said, "Then ye shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you." The second instruction, he says, "And destroy all their pictures, and destroy all their molten images, and quite pluck down all their high places." What's God wanting them to do there? What's the goal of this? This driving out and this destroying that he's calling his people to do. His goal is purification. God is a holy God, and he wants you and I to be holy as he is holy. He expects holiness in the lives of his people. And so he's purifying this land ahead of them before they get to the last instructions to dwell there and to divide it among themselves. God's wanting to eliminate the idolaters and idolatry. He's wanting to get that out of the way before his people can settle there. Step 3 is to dwell. He says, "And ye shall," in verse 53, "and ye shall dispossess the inhabitants of the land and dwell therein." God meant for this to be their homeland. This was not just a vacation spot. It was not just a stopover. They were to stay there. God has a place for his people, and we need to find that place, and then we need to stay there. We don't need to get restless. We don't need to be discontent all the time, looking for something better. Me and Denny were talking about how so many times today that people think the grass is greener on the other side. You'll find something better around the corner. Paul said to be content in whatsoever state you find yourself in. And so when God put them there, he meant for them to stay there. And even to this day and forevermore, that is their homeland, the homeland of the Jewish people. So he wanted them to dwell there. And step 4 was to divide it. In verse 54, he says, "And ye shall divide the land by lot for an inheritance among your families." God meant for them to share this land. This was to be the homeland of all his people. He says, "Divide it by lot for an inheritance among your families." They were like a big family, all of them. They were the 12 tribes of Israel. They were all descended from the same man. So they were really one big family and individual families inside of that family. That's how we are, or that's how we're supposed to be. That's how God wants us to be. Collectively, we are the family of God. We are part of the church. We are part of the body of Christ, which is a worldwide group. And we belong to that family. Here we are as an individual congregation, and we call this our church family. It's all about the family, folks. The family was the very first thing that God ever instituted in this world. He set that up from the very beginning with Adam and Eve. The family came before everything else, and that includes the church. So guess what? We don't need to put anything before our families, right? If we're going to follow God's priorities, his order that he has established and that he has set up, we need to focus on our families and truly put them first. It's what his kingdom's built on. And so as we have looked over the years and we've watched the breakdown of the family and how that you've got groups now in the world that are seeking the destruction of the nuclear family, that should alarm us, or at the very least concern us greatly, because that's the foundation of everything. It's all about families. So divide it. That was the 4th step. He said, "Unto the more ye shall give the more inheritance, and to the fewer ye shall give the less inheritance." That just makes too much sense, don't it? I mean, it's completely simple and basic, but how could you do better than that? So what God was telling them here is keep politics out of it. Don't play favorites. Don't let one be preferred above another, which is exactly how he wants us to be, exactly how he wants us to treat one another. He is no respecter of persons, and neither should we be. Or not be no pets, no favorites in God's house. And he said, whoever's got the most people, give them the most land. Whoever's got fewer people, give them less land. I love that we serve a God like that. That just keeps it simple and does things the right way. That's as fair and as just as it could be, don't you think? Absolutely. He says, every man's inheritance shall be in the place where his lot falleth. According to the tribes of your fathers ye shall inherit. But, here comes the but. But, if ye will not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come to pass. What you got here is a condition. Anytime you got an if, there's going to be a then. And you got that. God says, if ye will not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you. Step one, remember? Step one was drive out. You cannot do God's will. You cannot be obedient to God if you don't do step one. Forget step 2 through 4, or however many steps there may be. Where God says start, that's where we have to start. And if we can't do that, if we can't do step 1, we'll not get to the rest. It starts with being faithful where God says to be faithful. He says, if you're not going to do this, if you don't do this, then here's what will happen. Here's what's going to come to pass. That those which ye let remain of them shall be pricks in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and shall vex you in the land wherein ye dwell. Those which ye let remain. There was a time before I knew the Lord when I had things in my life and people in my life that I loved and enjoyed. But as of March the 6th, 1988, I had a decision to make. Because that was the night God saved me. And I became a part of His family. I became His child. And the decision at that point was, what was I going to let remain? You ever thought about that? What did you carry over from before? From your old life? Your life prior to Christ? Prior to the new life? What did you let remain? Who did you let remain? You have to be careful, don't you? That's what God was warning them about here. You need to be careful about who you let remain, who you let hang around and stay in your life. He said, because they'll be pricks in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and shall vex you, trouble you greatly, trouble you terribly in the land wherein you live, where you dwell. You'll get to step 3 and step 4, you'll dwell there, you'll be where you're supposed to be, but you're going to have problems. You're going to have continual irritants in your life. That's what they will be to you. And if that weren't bad enough, in verse 56, God says, moreover, so above and beyond this condition that I've just given you, that I've just warned you about, moreover, it shall come to pass that I shall do unto you as I thought to do unto them. That would be a little scary, don't you think? God's saying the judgment that was meant for them, their fate will come upon you. So God was very serious about His instructions for conquering Canaan. All right, let's go back to Joshua now. In verse 13. But as for the cities that stood still in their strength, Israel burned none of them, save Hazor only. That did Joshua burn. So the other cities, they choose not to do this, even though they stood still in their strength. Don't know if this was maybe a miscalculation on their part. Maybe it was laziness on their part. Maybe they didn't just take the time to do this. God had not specifically instructed them to burn any of these cities. So we don't really know. But what we do know is that it would cause problems later, some of the things that they did not carry out. Verse 14 says, "And all the spoil of these cities and the cattle the children of Israel took for a prey unto themselves. But every man they smote with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them. Neither left they any to breathe." So they don't burn down these other cities. Hazor is the only city that they do burn, and they take the valuables of these places, the cattle, for a reward for themselves. But they do make sure that every man dies. They don't leave anybody breathing in any of these places. And verse 15 says, "As the Lord commanded Moses his servant, so did Moses command Joshua, and so did Joshua. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord commanded Moses." So here's what you got. The Lord commanded Moses. Moses commanded Joshua. So did Joshua. That says a lot. Because what you've got there is God speaking to God's man, to Moses. And Moses, God's man, speaking to God's soldier, to God's servant. This is how the commands are supposed to come, right? Straight from God to God's man to God's soldiers. God commands his man, God commands the soldier does. That's how it's supposed to work. If that's what we were to do, if that's how we were to be, I believe we'd be much more effective. We'd see much more happening, accomplishing so much more for the Lord. It's not complicated, okay? And what you have here also, besides the order of things for giving God's commands, you've got a legacy of faithfulness. It's being passed down here. You see that? From God to Moses to Joshua. There's a legacy there. I look back at my family. We were talking about the family and the legacy of faithfulness that there was before me. And I am very proud of that, what my ancestors have done. And I realize that now is my time to uphold that legacy, to see that it continues. You and I, this is our day. We are the generation that has been chosen for these times. And we can look back through the history of each of our families and see the faithfulness that has been carried out. And we need to be the ones to say, you know, I want that to continue. And so I want to do my part to see that it does. What you also have to think about here is generational transference. That was a fancy word, wasn't it? Generational transference. It's being transferred from one generation to the next. How's it going to get to the next generation? Are they going to stumble upon it? It's just going to happen in some miraculous way? The way God expects it to happen is this generation passes it on to the next. God's Word speaks very clearly about how we are to teach our children, how we are to train them up in the way that they should go. That's our job. That's our responsibility. If the next generation doesn't get it, it's not that generation's fault. I don't believe. We like to blame it on the kids. Say, oh, these kids today, they just don't care. Maybe they do, but maybe we haven't transferred it like we should have. It's something to think about, don't you think? It really is. And I am out of time. Comments or questions?
I know this is sort of out of the question. Which one of these tribes is Palestinian? They didn't learn.
What now?
The Palestinians, which one of these tribes you think is that they didn't learn?
They didn't kill. That they didn't kill?
Yeah.
The Gibeonites.
So the Palestinians are Gibeonites?
Well, actually, all these people, I believe, are considered to be Palestinians. They're not going to kill we'll get to that. You're not going to kill them all. There'll be quite a few left. Anything else? All right, we're praying about Sunday. We'll start our mini-series on the end of the world. I really want God to use that in His way, for His glory. So be praying about that, would you? All right, all hearts and minds clear. All right, let's stand.